Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to share that I recently launched 365 Days with Medieval and Renaissance Wonder Women. This immersive learning experience is much more than just an online course. Over 12 months in 2025, participants will come together and contribute to a supportive and inspiring online community of individuals who share in a unique learning experience, one that will ultimately deepen their understanding of the lives and experiences of medieval and Renaissance women. Together, we'll explore the contributions made by a variety of European women and celebrate, among other qualities, their courage, creativity, resourcefulness, and resilience. I will guide participants every step of the way, but I'll also be joined by a stellar list of 28 contributors, including the brilliant broadcaster, best-selling author, and Oxford academic Professor Janina Ramirez, who'll deliver the opening address. Head to my website, onthetudortrail.com, for further details, including a full list of sessions and presenters and testimonials from current participants. I do hope you'll consider joining me on this unique learning experience. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love Talking Tudors and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. When you join the patron family, you will instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and take part in a member-only book club. They can also enter patron-only monthly giveaways, to name but a few of the perks. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the podcast to talk about Anne Boleyn's trial records is Dr. Dan Gosling. Dr. Gosling is Principal Legal Records Specialist at the National Archives, specialising in the records created by the Central Law Courts circa 1485 to 1841. He formerly worked as Archives Assistant at the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. His recent research includes work on the 15th century Court of Chancery, the records of the Court of Star Chamber, and gender nonconformity in the 18th century King's Bench. He's a co-author of A History of Treason, which includes a section examining how Anne Boleyn's downfall fit in with the general history of treason from the medieval to the modern. Let's dive straight in. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Dan. How are you?
I am good, thanks, Nat.
It's lovely to have you back. It's been quite a while, actually, now, I think. So maybe let's just start with an introduction. Just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dan Gosling and I work at the National Archives UK as Principal Legal Record Specialist. So my background is actually late medieval history, but I'm now working with the early modern legal records at the National Archives, which includes Anne Boleyn's trial records.
Fantastic. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So I think let's just dive right in. So Dan, tell us a little bit about the records that actually survive relating to Anne Boleyn's trial and her execution as well.
Yeah. So As you all know, Anne was tried on 15th of May 1536, a special trial in the Tower of London. The case was tried at common law, which meant that the records were recorded and collected with other records of the Central Common Law Courts, and these records are now held at National Archives. So that's why they're now at National Archives. And Anne's trial records, along with the trial records of her alleged adulterers, are held in a special King's Bench series called The Bag of Secrets, the Baga de Secretis. And the National Archives actually also holds a copy of Queen Anne Boleyn's execution warrant, which was entered into a Chancery precedent book.
Wonderful. And so I love this, Bag of Secrets. You could just write a whole novel just with that title, couldn't you? But can you tell us a little bit about maybe the history of these bags? And I believe they're actual physical bags, so I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So the term sort of Baga de Secretis dates from around the mid-14th century, is the first time I think we've seen it used. It originally only refers to records that could only be accessed by certain authorised staff of the Royal Law Court. So it was sort of marked secret to say for your eyes only. The term referred to indictments of the Court of King's Bench. So indictments are the formal charges that were made against the person. We'll be talking about quite a lot of those today relating to Anne Boleyn. And there are also special commissions, which are called oyer and termine commissions. So oyer and termine from the Latin literally means to hear and determine, and that's what these commissions were. They were special commissions to go out and hear and determine a sort of wrongdoing that happened in a particular county. But by the Tudor period, these bags of secrets took on a more specific meaning. So they referred instead to a few cases of particular constitutional or political importance. So the first likely case for this new sort of secret repository was the trial of Edward, Earl of Warwick, who in 1499 was tried for treason because he was conspiring with Perkin Warbeck in the Tower to overthrow Henry VII. After that point, these bags of secrets became leather bags filled with trial records relating to a particular trial, which had either sort of constitutional or political importance. And these bags were leather bags, and all of the relevant trial records were rolled up. So they included commissions, plea rolls, jury lists, and stored in the bags. And we know about these bags because, like the records themselves, these bags also survive and are included. So if you ever order up and look at the records, a lot of the time you get these leather bags in with the records as well, so you can see them as well.
So in terms of Anne Boleyn's bag of secrets, what records are actually held in that particular bag?
So relating to Anne Boleyn's downfall, there's actually two relevant bags of secrets. So the first, which has the modern document reference KB8/8, contains the trial records of Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir William Brereton, and Sir Francis Weston, who were four of the men with whom Anne was accused of committing adultery with. And then the next record in the series, KB8/9, contains the trial and conviction of Queen Anne Boleyn and her brother, Lord Rochford. And these records give us a really good sense of the legal process for these trials. So Smeaton, Norris, Brereton and Weston were tried on the 12th of May, 1536, 3 days before Anne was. And the earliest records in their bag of secrets are dated 24th of April, 1536. So that's a few weeks earlier. And these are the records of oyer and termine, the commissions for the counties of Kent and Middlesex. So that's the beginning of any formal investigation into any wrongdoing for these men. And so the indictment, which is these formal charges laid against the accused, were drawn from these oyer and termine commissions. So what happens where the commissions were sent out, the commissioners investigated the county's wrongdoing, and they would draw up an indictment, these formal charges that would then be delivered. And then those charges are what someone is judged against in the trial themselves. So these records, the indictments, are also in KB8, so Smeaton's bond in KB8/8. And then other records of interest in this file are the lists of the various juries that are appointed to try these men. So you get the names of all of the men that are named to try them, and only a few of them actually appear and are sworn. So there's little marks next to the names to say which ones actually appeared and which ones actually sat in jury. So that's for Smeaton's trial. It's a little bit different for Anne Boleyn's trial, but I'll talk about that in a second. And there's an interesting note. This is still in sort of Smeaton's trial records. One of the indictments, which is dated 10th of May 1536, so this is 2 days before the men were tried, they were found guilty of high treason by committing adultery with Anne Boleyn. But because these charges were similar to those that Anne herself was accused of, the indictment in Smeaton's bag of secrets and the subsequent guilty verdict was actually used to support the accusations against Anne. And so the note against this indictment mentioned that it was sent to Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, who was the judge in the trial, who was also uncle of Anne Boleyn. So because it related to the trial of Anne, there's a note on this indictment to say you need to bring this to Anne's trial because it's relevant, it's pertinent to Anne's case. And then in Anne Boleyn's trial records, so that's the next record, the next bag in the series, KB8/9, you get a similar picture of the legal process which leads up to and includes her trial held at the Tower of London on 15th of May, 1536. So the longest section of Anne Boleyn's trial record in KB8/9 is the plea roll entry. This recorded the pleadings of the case. Quite frustratingly for us modern audiences, this doesn't record what was actually said. So it's not like a court transcript like we might expect today, but instead is a record of the legal process. So it includes the indictments and the charges against the accused, their plea, so guilty or not guilty, and then whether or not they were found guilty of what they were accused. And then you get some other documents like writs, which was sent out to sort of move that process along. So for Anne Boleyn's plea roll entry, it opens with a recital of the commission, which is dated 12th of May 1536, which appoints Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Lord High Steward, and Anne Boleyn's uncle, as judge for her case. And this original commission is also held in with Anne Boleyn's trial records. The actual text of the record is quite formulaic. It literally just says the king appoints Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, as judge. But it's a really nice looking document because it's a commission from the king. It's got Henry VIII's Great Seal attached to it, which has a little bit of wear and tear on it, but you can still make out a lot of the Great Seal. So it's a nice looking document. I think you can purchase it as a puzzle at the National Archives shop if you ever wanted to see a puzzle with that. And so the day after on the 13th of May, there's a load of writs that are sent out to sort of move the court process along. And these are either recorded in the plea roll and sometimes are actually also in the bag of secrets as well, the individual writs. So there's a writ sent to the justices who undertaken the Oyo and Termine commissions against Anne Boleyn, and that was ordering them to return all the indictments that they had found against the Queen and her brother, Lord Rochford. And they couldn't be tried if the judge and jury didn't know what they were formally accused of. So that's why those writs are sent out. We would like to see the indictments so we know what we're trying these people for. Writs were also sent to Sir William Kingston, who's Constable of the Tower, to bring Queen Anne and Lord Rochford before the Lord High Steward when required. So at this point, Anne and her brother have been imprisoned to await trial, so that writ just sort of moves that process of physically bringing them to the court. The same day, actually, a load more writs are sent out to these same people because they find out the date of the trial is going to be 15th of May. So they are writs that are almost identical in wording. They've just added, oh yeah, the indictment needs to be delivered on 15th of May, or Queen Anne needs to be brought up on 15th of May. So they sort of hastily draw some more up later in the day when they know the date of things moving along. And then I mentioned juries earlier. For Queen Anne and her brother, because they held such high status in England, and because men and women had to be tried by a jury of their peers at common law, there was another writ that needed to be sent out on the same day, 13th of May, which ordered that Ralph Felmingham, who was Sergeant at Arms, to summon as many lords and magnates of the Kingdom of England so that they can come and by whom the truth of the matter could be better known. So because they are nobility, Anne and her brother, they need to be tried by nobility. You have to be tried by a jury of your peers. So that writ is basically sending out for any peers that are around to come and attend the trial. 2 days before the trial, I might add. So you're not going to be able to travel from across the country to get there. But I think people that knew the trial was happening would have been there if they knew they were likely to be called up. And then after all that setup, the plea roll entry then dives into sort of the trial proper, which took place on 15th of May, 1536. And then it notes things like the indictments were delivered as requested, Queen Anne and her brother were physically brought to the trial by the constable, and Ralph Felmingham had successfully summoned a jury. And then the text of the indictments is entered onto the plea roll at this point. So that's the formal charges against the Queen and her brother, detailing sort of the times that the Queen had committed adultery and who with. And then after the indictments, the plea roll records the pleas of Queen Anne and Lord Rochford. They both say they're not guilty. And then it pronounces judgment. They're both found guilty of high treason. And then the plea roll entry concludes with their punishments. So Anne is to be burned or beheaded, and George is to be hanged, drawn and quartered. So these are the punishments for high treason.
Yeah, quite horrific. And it is such a pity that we don't have the actual transcript of what was said, to see if they...
so frustrating.
Oh, it's so frustrating.
There are chronicles from the time, and there are law reports from people that were actually sitting in the trial, so we can get a little bit of a sense. But yeah, not to have the actual court transcripts is incredibly frustrating.
It is frustrating. So you mentioned there that obviously the details of her alleged crimes are part of these documents. So what's the language and the tone of all of these records?
Yeah, so King's Bench records are great because they're trying the most sort of serious crimes and treason and witchcraft and things like that. But they can also be very frustrating if you go in because they're very formulaic legal records and they're in Latin. So sometimes they can be quite impenetrable and not get the information you want as easily as you want. And Anne Boleyn's trial records are very much like that. In many ways, they are very formulaic, They're written in Latin. They're created for a very specific purpose. It's to record the trial process rather than what people are saying. All the court's really interested in is, has this process been followed properly? So sometimes the language amounts to little more than just a command to summon people. So certain people or documents or commission appointing justices. You don't necessarily get much of the actual story of the trial itself. But there are little sort of nuggets within these records where the language strays away from these formulaic phrases. And it's usually during the indictment, because that's sort of unique to each case, the specific charges that someone is tried with. And this is exactly what happens in Anne Boleyn's trial records when it's describing the specific offences that Anne and her adulterers have allegedly committed. So the Crown case is built upon the alleged adulteries of Anne Boleyn and her would-be suitors. And so it goes into detail about the meetings between Anne and these men, and more detail than you perhaps expect to find from this sort of legal record. So there's several examples of this in the trial record, but I think for me, the most sort of salacious language is saved for the description of Anne's adultery with her brother, George Boleyn. So for the purposes of the Crown case, all that really needs to be stated is the date of the alleged adultery along with some minor detail. And this is included in the indictment. Anne met with her brother on 2nd of November 1535 and compelled him to commit adultery with her, an act that was committed on 5th of November that same year. But the indictment goes into further detail, and I'm going to quote here, and it doesn't get too scandalous, but it says, Queen Anne Boleyn on 2nd of November 1535 did procure and incite George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, her natural brother and a gentleman in the Privy Chamber, to violate and carnally know the Queen and have illicit intercourse with her, with their tongues in each other's mouths, kissing with their eyes wide open, against all the natural laws of God and man, and that he violated and carnally knew his sister, the Queen, on 5th of November in the same year at Westminster. So there's a lot of extra detail there, which we'd argue probably isn't necessary. We don't need to know that they're kissing with their tongues in each other's mouths or their eyes wide open, which is a very weird way to kiss anyway. So they only really need the dates. And I think one of the questions we can ask is, why were the descriptions of these alleged adulteries so graphic? And I think the answer becomes clearer when we examine the actual case against Anne Boleyn and work out why they need to sort of make these adulteries so scandalous and make them out to be so important as part of the legal case.
So do you think, Dan, that it actually strengthens the Crown's case, or in a way, do you feel that it almost weakens it by adding these kind of salacious details?
I think it strengthens the Crown's case, but the Crown's case is actually quite complicated. I've been thinking about it for a long time and trying to piece it together in terms of sort of the legal side of things. So I mean, when we think about the Crown's case, the best place to start is these alleged liaisons between Anne Boleyn and the men accused of committing adultery with her, partly because that is the first thing that's mentioned in the indictment, the formal charges. So if we want to understand the Crown case, you look to the indictment, because that is the formal sort of statement of the case against the charges against Anne Boleyn. So the first offences described in this indictment are these adulterous acts. Anne Boleyn is accused of committing adultery with several of the king's servants in order to bring them under her influence. And then it goes on to sort of the dates and times that she met with these men. So 6th of October 1533, she convinced Henry Norris to have illicit intercourse with her, and they committed that at Westminster on 12th of October. 3rd of December 1533, William Brereton, she's convinced him to do the same. And they actually committed that at Hampton Court on Christmas Day, 25th of December, 1533, according to the indictment. And then, 1534, Mark Smeaton and Sir Francis Weston, the same. And it said sort of the places this happened. And then finally is that really scandalous one with George Boleyn committed in November, 1535. But I think a quite important point to note and remember is it's shocking for a modern audience. It's also shocking for a contemporary audience, but it's not treason. They're scandalous, but for Anne, it's not treason. Adultery was not in itself a treasonable offence, and adultery against the king did not become treasonable until after Catherine Howard's execution, 1542. And normally adultery cases wouldn't have been heard at English common law anyway. Sins against God, such as the breaking of marriage vows or even incest, should more correctly have been prosecuted in the ecclesiastical courts. So adultery and incest aren't normally tried at common law. Treason, however, is. And treason is sort of the worst crime you can commit. So it is exclusively held or heard at common law, Court of King's Bench, in particular because it's a superior court in the realm. So to justify trying Anne in King's Bench, her crime needed to be more than adultery, more even than incest. So her actions needed to be considered treasonous. So for them to find her guilty, they need to find her guilty of treason, not just the adultery. As an aside, this is actually less of an issue for the charges against the men accused of committing adultery of Anne, because in committing adultery with the Queen, those men are actually committing treason, because the Treason Act, which was enacted in January 1352, which is that great statute of treasons, which the definition of treason to this day relies on these acts that are laid out in his 14th century statute. This lists among its treasonable acts the violation of the king's companion. So sleeping with the Queen is a treasonable act. So those men, if they're found guilty of adultery, they can be found guilty of high treason because that is a treasonable act. But for Anne, which is the other way around, she's committing adultery against the king, which, while ill-advised, is not actually a treasonable act under the law of statute. So to find Anne guilty of treason, they need to somehow tie this adultery and incest into an actual treasonable offence. So I think this is why they're going into so much detail about the adultery and the incest, because they'll tie it to the treason and then they just need to prove the adultery to prove the treason. And this, you get the sense this is what's happening in the indictment. So after listing all of these adulteries in great detail, they go on to explain how these adulteries are leading to Anne committing treason. So it says that after she's inveigled George Boleyn, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston and Mark Smeaton to her will through illicit intercourse. And the indictment actually describes how these men were inflamed by carnal love for the Queen. It says that Anne and her suitors could compass and imagine the king's death. And this is a really key phrase, compass and imagine, because this alludes directly to another treasonable offence that's defined in the 1352 Act, to compass and imagine the death of the king. So Anne's indictment is now directly tying her adulterous acts to treason. And the indictment actually adds a few further details after this compass and imagine. So Anne promised to marry one of her suitors should the king die, and she was affirming she never truly loved the king. So again, this is sort of wishing the death of the king that she can marry someone else. And then there's a really interesting sort of passage after this that says that when Henry VIII learned of this betrayal, he was so aggrieved that he became ill, which endangered his life, which sounds a little bit ridiculous again to modern ears, but this, believe it or not, is actually another treasonable act by this point, endangering the king's life in any way, however sort of circumstantial or tangentially. And this idea of hearing things that make you unwell or prepare your life is actually quite a common theme in libel and defamation cases among ordinary people, that something had been written, printed or said that harmed someone so much to the point of physical harm. So you see in cases like Star Chamber court cases where someone has brought in a libel about their wife that made their wife so sad that she sadly died, and they're bringing a case because the libel was printed. So it's actually quite a common thing. So it's not that remarkable to see it here, but it's very interesting. They're really sort of stacking up the case against Anne, trying to find as many ways that this adultery could be linked and tied to treason. They actually add another one right at the end that say, by her committing adultery, it's impacting the legitimacy of any royal heirs that she and the king has. So it's not just imperiling the king's life, it's putting the king's dynasty at peril, which is almost as bad. I mean, probably for Henry VIII, he would say it's as bad. So what the indictment's done in it's quite a long passage, and it's setting this up, is framing Anne's misdeeds, which were largely non-treasonable deeds, and has tied it to the treasonable deed, to compassing the king's death. And what this means is if Anne's found guilty of the lesser offence, she would, by association, be guilty of the treason, or very likely to be found guilty of the treason. And unfortunately for Anne, on 12th of May, 3 days earlier, the men accused of committing adultery had been found guilty of high treason for committing adultery with the Queen. And worse still, one of their number, Mark Smeaton, had pleaded guilty to adultery with the Queen. So even before they'd been tried and judged guilty, Smeaton had said, yes, he did, and admitted to the adultery. He actually said he was not guilty to all of the rest of the stuff, trying to kill the king, but he crucially said, yes, I committed adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. So what this meant was that the adultery had already been confirmed by a judgment in the same court. So no matter how strong a defence Anne Boleyn made, and again, frustratingly, her defence is not recorded in the trial record, but we do get a sense of it from chronicles, she was likely to be found guilty of treason for her part in these same offences. And this is exactly what happens. And then Anne is sentenced, she's found guilty, she's sentenced to be brought before the Green within the Tower of London, where she was to be burned or beheaded as the king saw fit. So quite a complex build-up, but it's tying all of this adultery into the treason, and there's a lot of quite complex things going on behind the scenes, I think, in trying to set up a strong case against the Queen.
Yeah, I remember marvelling at the fact that I think it's on the 8th of January, from memory, 1536, so the day after Catherine of Aragon's death, that she's accused of getting together with all the men to kind of conspire, the king's death. And I always wonder, like, really? The day after Catherine of Aragon's death, the day she's finally the only queen of England, she's still pregnant at the time, she hasn't lost that final baby yet. And I think, is she really going to, go and plan the king's death on that particular day where everyone's in sort of celebratory mode? It's just so bizarre, really. But yes, very complicated. And yes, definitely the treason is the clincher there. So interesting. So I always wonder as well, Dan, so if the men had already been found guilty of adultery and also conspiring the king's death, even though they all pleaded not guilty to those kinds of crimes, what was even the point of Anne's trial? Was it not just a foregone conclusion from the beginning? How could she escape the charges if the men are already found guilty? I've never quite understood that.
The men's trial records are sort of being brought in as evidence for Anne's, but in terms of the law, they're being treated as two separate cases. They might be intertwined and it might be a foregone conclusion, but there's never any suggestion of the actual legal process, something being wrong with the legal process. It might be quite a tenuous charge, but it was a valid charge and valid indictment, and they were using the evidence they had to suggest it. So I think that's the important thing. They can't say, "Oh, these men are guilty, so you are guilty." But they go through the whole process. But yes, very much so. Once the men are found guilty, the writing's really on the wall for Anne.
There's often this sort of suggestion that there's lots of the records missing, that there was a kind of a sense that something was destroyed on purpose, that documents, are not there that should be there. What's your sense on that, having looked at other, obviously, treason cases? Are there things that you would expect to be there that aren't?
Not really. So in Anne Boleyn's The Bag of Secrets in particular, there's some damage to a few of the records. Sort of the tops are damaged and sometimes the Great Seal has been removed. But this, I think, is more likely the result of centuries of being stored in the bag before they were eventually extracted and conserved in the 20th century, rather than any kind of intentional tampering at the time in the 16th century. I think quite frustrating thing is, compared to, say, records of Star Chamber or cases recorded in state papers, what these records don't include, just because that's not the sort of thing they recorded, can always be quite frustrating. So we don't hear about the investigation that led the Oyer and Termini commissioners to their damning indictments. We don't know how they found out these specific things about these specific liaisons, not from the trial records anyway. Don't include witness statements or even statements made by the defense other than their official plea of guilty or not guilty. So I think rather than being missing, when you look at these records, it's what we expect them to tell us. And sometimes they're just telling us these very formulaic things, so we don't get these lovely stories, which, if you're looking at, say, Star Chamber records or the printed state trials proceedings, which includes all of these statements and defenses, which can give you to paint this wonderful story of trials. When you look at The Bag of Secrets, if you go in expecting that, sometimes you can be a little bit disappointed. And also these records, they end rather abruptly because they are there just to record the trial process. They end at the pronouncement of judgment and punishment. So, and that's even if the punishment differed. So if someone is said they're going to be executed in a particular way and then were executed in a different way, they don't go back to the record to say this person was executed a different way. So this record alone might not actually tell you how someone was executed. The record just stops because that's the end of the trial process.
And we know that's what happens in this case, doesn't it? Because Anne and George are not executed, as it said. So maybe earlier you mentioned the execution warrant. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about what that particular document tells us? Yeah,
of course. This is a really remarkable document. It's contained in a Chancery precedent book, which covers the period of Anne's execution. So the Chancery Office was the Secretariat of the Crown. It's responsible for drawing up writs, letters patent, any formal writing issued by the Crown. And as such, it would have been the Chancery officers that are responsible for writing the execution warrant for Anne Boleyn and all of those other writs that we've sort of seen and been described in Anne Boleyn's trial records. It would be the clerks of Chancery. You go to Chancery to get all of these things drawn up. And the point of these Chancery precedent books was to record unusual or unique writs and processes so that if such an event occurred again, the Chancery would know the correct processes to follow. And so other examples in these precedent books, and I've sort of looked through them just to see what interesting stuff in there. There's loads of interesting stuff in there, not just Anne Boleyn. But you get things like how to formally dismiss someone from the bench. So like Edward Coke was dismissed in the early 17th century. They use Edward Cook's example to say this is the formal process you go to remove someone from the bench. And there's also a really interesting, I think it's from the mid 17th century, it's the correct process for replacing the Great Seal once a monarch dies. So there's this formal sort of almost ceremonial process where you bring the old seal, you have to break the seal in front of officers of state before a new one is made. So for Anne Boleyn, the inclusion of writs relating to Anne Boleyn's trial and execution, they demonstrate what a truly historic event it was. And there's one whole page of 5 writs in this Chancery precedent, but the actual execution warrant itself doesn't survive as far as we know. So we're very lucky that it was entered into these Chancery precedent books, so we know the exact text of this execution warrant, of this writ. So there's 5 writs on this page. This has the modern document reference C193/3, and then Anne's execution warrant is on folio 80. And the first of these writs is a writ of 17th of May, and that orders the delivery of Rochford, Norris, Brierson, Weston, Smeaton into the custody of the sheriffs of London for execution. So this is after both the trials. And then there's another writ that orders the sheriffs to carry out the executions by beheading on Tower Hill. So 2 writs to just summon the men and then tell them to sort out the execution. The third writ on the page contains the order for the trial justices to deliver the records to the Duke of Norfolk. And we know that that was completed because of the memoranda on the indictments against Smeaton and the rest, which said they were delivered to Norfolk on 15th of May. And then additionally, the text of this third writ is actually entered onto the plea roll for Anne's trial in KB 89. So you can compare the text in the plea roll entry to this writ. It's exactly the same. So this is part of Anne's trial process, this delivery of the other indictments that are related to her case. And then the fourth writ on this page is dated 17th of May, and that orders the delivery of Anne, George, and the others into the Duke of Norfolk's custody ahead of their execution. And then the final writ on the page is Anne Boleyn's execution warrant, and this details the manner and location of the Queen's execution. And the writ's only a few lines long. It's in Latin, but I'm going to read out sort of what it says here. So it says, "The King to William Kingston, Knight, Constable of his Tower of London, greeting. Whereas Anne, late Queen of England, lately our wife, recently attainted and convicted of high treason towards us by her committed and done and adjudged to death, that is to say, by burning of fire according to the statute, law and custom of our realm of England, or decapitation at our choice and will, remains in your custody within our tower aforesaid. We, moved by pity, do not wish the same Anne to be receipt of these presents. Upon the green within our Tower of London aforesaid, the head of the same Anne shall be caused to be cut off." So it's a really remarkable writ. It doesn't actually add much to what we know from the reports of Eustace Chapuis or the contemporary chronicle by Edward Hall, but it does confirm that the king had a choice in how Anne was executed. And in this writ, he claims that he's being merciful in his choice to allow beheading, not wishing for Anne to be burned by fire. Because the women found guilty of high treason, the punishment for women for high treason was to be burned alive, and then hanging, drawing, and quartering for men. But one of the most detailed, it's really interesting that Henry even had a choice for the method of Anne's execution. And one of the contemporary law reports, someone was actually there at Anne's trial, gives a detailed report of the judgment and notes that judges were shocked when the Duke of Norfolk says she is to be killed by the method of high treason or beheading because she's a queen, as the king decides. And there's a little comment in the law report. It's Sir John Spellman, the lawyer who wrote the report, and he comments to say there's a murmuring among the judges because the like judgment had never been made before. But he also notes John Spellman's reports also makes a note when the queen is executed and says how she's been executed by a man from Calais in a very professional manner on the green. And he notes there, sort of says it was an unprecedented decision to give the king the choice, but it was unprecedented because this is the first queen that has been executed for treason. It's an unprecedented event. So Spellman notes there, he said, well, actually, that's probably fair that he's given the choice there.
Goodness, it's so chilling, isn't it? That like these writs on one page, they're the death of 6 people, including an anointed queen, and it's quite incredible. And it's interesting also that considering that these are precedents, that then with Catherine Howard, she was executed by axe. I wonder why that changed in between.
Why use an act of attainder, or why go through the common law system? Earlier in Henry VIII's reign, you see like Elizabeth Barton, who was the Maid of Kent, they tried to go through the common law process and found that the case didn't quite stick at the time. They had to change the treason laws afterwards. So they went for act of attainder because act of attainder was just a parliamentary act. So if it passed through Parliament, that was finding them guilty. So it was almost an easier way. They didn't have to be tried by a jury of their peers. They weren't found guilty or not guilty. If the act passed, that was their guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a slightly easier way, perhaps, to condemn someone, but at the same time it's risky because you use it too much, you start to sort of, treason gets watered down a bit, it loses its impact and meaning, and that's in fact exactly what happens. I always found it when I was looking at the treason records, whenever the Sikh comes to the throne, one of the first things he does is repeals all of Henry VIII's treason statutes, because he basically says it's very important to have a strong treason law for the worst crime you can commit, but it's been watered down a bit in the reign of my father. And a bit is an understatement, really, what Henry was doing with it. So I do wonder, from Catherine Howard's sense, it's just easier for attainder because they can say, here are the adulteries, this is treason. Anne Boleyn was convicted of treason for similar reasons, but they don't want to have to go through the same process of having to build up the treason case. And then they change the law immediately afterwards to say, okay, if this happens again, it's just treason, so we can do it in the future.
Goodness, fascinating. And in terms of the record, so you mentioned that they were delivered into the hands of the Duke of Norfolk. So who could access them apart from him, and where would they have been kept? Do we know?
We don't know the exact location, but we do know where they're kept and sort of how they're kept. So from the point that the bag of secrets become these actual bags of secrets of these really sort of important state cases, so Henry VII's reign, these records get locked away in a special closet at Westminster. So they're not kept with all of the other King's Bench records, all the other legal records of the central courts. And we don't know the exact location of them. But this locked closet at Westminster, only 3 people held keys. It was the Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench, the Attorney General, and the Master of the Crown Office. And these 3 officers of state basically were the key holders for centuries, all the way up into 19th century. And if you wish to receive a copy of any of these records later on, you needed to get permission from one of these 3 key holders. You need to write a letter to one of these 3 people to say, I need a copy of this, or I need to know some of the details of this record. And we've actually, at the National Archives, there's a wonderful collection of 19th century letters in one of the King's Bench Miscellaneous series, KB 33. And this concerns applications to view records held in a bag of secrets. And I was looking through these, and there was one gentleman's name coming up time and time again, asking for copies of the trial records of Guy Fawkes. And it was quite funny because he's clearly writing, not really sure who he needs to contact. And eventually he gets the permission of the Attorney General to say, yes, you can get a copy. And then you see Attorney General's letter to say, could you give this gentleman a copy of Guy Fawkes's treason trial, which again is in another KB8, Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plotters. And then when I was having a little look, digging about for this guy, I found he'd actually written a 19th century history of the Gunpowder Plot. So he's requesting those records for his own research. So sort of a 19th century researcher just wanting to know more about these records. But he had to write to, these great officers of state just to view these records.
Yeah, that is interesting. He was trying to be thorough with his research, so that's good.
Yeah,
not all 19th century writers were, that's for sure. Dan, and in terms of other state trials that took place in the 16th century, are there, do we have quite a lot of information about other state trials?
We do. At the National Archives, we have any state trial that was heard at common law, so King's Bench or this sort of special trial like Anne Boleyn. Those what we sort of call state trials the records are held at the National Archives, sometimes in KB8, but KB8 is very much an arbitrary series. So sometimes treason trials would go in there, sometimes they just stay in the main King's Bench series. It seemed to be up to the monarch at the time whether or not they ended up in there. But it's only those common law state trials that end up in the National Archives. If a state trial was heard, so basically on the authority of Parliament, for example, or if it's like a special trial, a special jury of Privy Council or something, the records aren't held in these central legal repositories. So a couple of good, Mary Queen of Scots trial, because it was a special trial sort of set up by the council, and those records of the trials are in state papers collections, being the papers created by sort of the Privy Council and the investigations, but it wasn't part of a formal common law process, so those records aren't in those central common law. So there isn't a bag of secrets for Mary Queen of Scots. There is for Babington and a lot of the other Elizabeth I sort of conspirators, because they were tried but for treason at common law. Another one which isn't in KB8 is King Charles I's trial, because that was a trial on the authority of the Commons, and it was heard by the Commons. It wasn't heard at common law in King's Bench. So the records we have of the trial again are in state papers because they were sort of drawn in state papers. So there are records at the National Archives relating to these trials, but not in the same way that Anne Boleyn's trial records are sort of all brought together. And if you ever want sort of the full picture of a lot of these trials, you have to go to the printed collection, like the Cobbett's state trials, which covers sort of medieval up to present day for Cobbett. And that's where you get what people said, then drawing on contemporary chronicles. But yeah, in terms of the actual records, if it's a common law, it's great because you're going to get it in a National Archive and legal collections. Otherwise, you're going to have to look in state papers or other repositories like the British Library to try and find these records.
And so who can actually view and study these documents today, and how would you go about that if you wanted to have a look at them?
Well, if the records are held at National Archives, all you need to do is register for a reader's ticket, which you can do for free online. And you will need to visit at Kew, but you can order all of these documents to view in our reading rooms at Kew. Anne Boleyn's trial record is an invigilation room document because it's so popular, because so many people want to view it. They want to limit the amount of usage or you get, but you can order it up if you have a reader's ticket. You just have to go into a different room to view it.
Dan, this has been so great. Thank you so much for clarifying so many things about this particular trial and records. It's been really wonderful to have you back on and talk Tudors again.
It's been great to chat. Yeah, it's very confusing, isn't it?
I have to say it is quite confusing.
If I'm confused, I mean, I think at the time you must have been confused as well. Particularly Anne must have been so confused because she wouldn't have heard most of these allegations until she gets into the trial room itself.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying that must have been, to be honest. But you know, the other records tell us that they still defended themselves with great wit and intelligence. Yeah. So, you know, that's the caliber of people we're talking about. But thank you again. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nat.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.